Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Hilliard at Home. The topic for today's lecture is academic sources, what they are and how to find them. Okay, so question number one, of course, is what is an academic source? So an academic source is an article, book chapter, or a book written by a scholar or scholars within a particular field of study and for other scholars within that field of study or related fields. So academic sources are materials that are produced by scholars for other scholars. So this is not just kind of normal coffee table reading. It's more in-depth, it's analytical, it's putting forth arguments, and you have to spend some time with it to really kind of get at what's being said in an academic source. An academic source is published by an academic press and has gone through the process of peer review. So peer review is a very important concept. This is the idea. You guys do peer review in your classes where your peers look at what you've written and give you feedback. Now, when we're talking about academic publication, where scholars are trying to publish their materials, their peers are other scholars. So in this case, peer review means that anything that gets published by an academic press goes out, it's sent out by the editor to other scholars within that field of study, and they review it very carefully to make sure that it meets all the standards for publication within that academic field. And so anything that's published in an academic press has gone through a very rigorous process to make sure that it's well researched and it makes the right kinds of arguments and that those arguments are legitimate, etc. And that's part of what makes academic sources more reliable, not always right, but more reliable than other types of sources that you might encounter. Now, when we're talking about the types of sources that we would use for our own papers, this does not include things like book reviews, letters to the editors, brief notes, or little opinion pieces, or anything else that might appear in an academic journal but are not full-length peer-reviewed articles. So if you are looking through the contents of an academic journal, you might see some shorter pieces within that journal, but those aren't really the peer-reviewed articles. Those are just kind of extra content. So when we're looking for our sources, we want to look for those full-length peer-reviewed articles. Now, the next big question: how do I know when I'm looking at an academic source or not? So I've given you some of the kind of general information about what an academic source is, but that doesn't always tell us what we need to know in order to decide whether a particular source is academic or not. So one of the best pieces of advice that I can give you is to use the databases that are provided by the John B. Coleman Library. So I'm going to give you the rundown on several important databases that you can use to find academic sources for topics related to language and literature. And if you use those databases, it's very easy to tell what is an academic source and what is not. In some cases, the database only gives you academic sources. So I always recommend that. When you use any other source or a source that you find through other means, then sometimes that requires that we do a little background research on the publisher or on the journal title. So if you found a book and you're not sure whether it's an academic book or not, or if you got on Google Scholar, which I don't necessarily recommend, but I can't stop you from using Google Scholar. So and there are some good academic sources on there, but the fact that something is on Google Scholar does not necessarily mean that it's an academic source. And there is a lot of material behind paywalls that you don't have access to through Google Scholar. So if you're just using Google Scholar, you're not getting a very comprehensive search. But all that said, let's say we found a source and we're not sure whether it's academic or not. Let's say, just as an example, you find this book. You're researching Booker T. Washington, and this book is called Up From History: The Life of Booker T. Washington by Robert J. Norrell. You're not sure if it's an academic book or not, but you see that it's published by Belknap Press. If you were to do a quick Google search of Belknap Press just to do some background research on the publisher, you would quickly see that Belknap Press is owned and operated. It's kind of a subsidiary of Harvard University Press. So that right there tells you that this is an academic press. Any press that is run by a university, any university press, is kind of automatically an academic press. So you can stop right there. This is a good academic source. Okay, but not all academic presses are associated with a university. So let's say you found this book, Justice Interruptus, Critical Reflections on the Post-Socialist Condition by Nancy Fraser. Now, just by the title of that, it sounds pretty academic, right? But we want to double check and make sure, so we do a quick Google search of Routledge Press, and one good place to look is just the Wikipedia page. We're just doing background research. We're not looking for super credible sources. We just want to get some quick information. Wikipedia is fine. And if we were to pull up the Wikipedia page for Routledge Press, this is what the first paragraph of that page would look like. It says, Routledge is a British multinational publisher. It was founded in 1836 by George Routledge and specializes in providing academic books, journals, and online resources in the fields of humanities, behavioral science, education, law, and social science. So it's an academic press, right? The company publishes approximately 1,800 journals and 5,000 new books each year, and their backlist encompasses over 70,000 titles. Routledge is claimed to be the largest global academic publisher within humanities and social sciences. So it's pretty clear just from that blurb that Routledge is a good academic press, and therefore that this book is an academic source. We might also find journal articles that we're not sure whether the journal is an academic journal or not. And again, just a little background research can be very helpful. So let's say we find an article and it is in this journal, Texas Studies in Texas Studies in Literature and Language. Again, just the title sounds pretty academic, but we always want to double check and make sure, right? So again, if we just go to the Wikipedia page for Texas Studies in Literature and Language, here's what we find. This journal, commonly known as TSLL, is a peer-reviewed academic journal devoted to the humanities. That tells us pretty much everything we need to know right there. We've got peer-reviewed, that's one of the key phrases we're looking for, and it says it's an academic journal. It publishes essays reflecting a variety of critical approaches and all periods of literary history, with selected issues centering on special topics. Founded in 1911 as Studies in English, it was subsequently issued as the University of Texas Studies in English and Texas Studies in English before assuming its current name. It remains, quote, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, scholarly journals of its kind in North America. So that sounds pretty good. This is a legitimate, peer-reviewed academic journal. So any article that we find in here would be a peer-reviewed academic article. Now, once again, any given issue of Texas Studies in Literature and Language might have some other content in it, like an introduction by the editor, or letters to the editor, or little like opinion editorials, and things like that, or book reviews. That's another big one. And if you encounter any of that kind of material, those aren't the full-length articles that are going to be fully peer-reviewed, etc. But if you're looking at one of the articles there, it will be peer-reviewed and a good academic source. Okay, let's talk about the library databases, because as I mentioned previously, using the library databases is the best way to ensure that you are getting good academic source material. So the John B. Coleman Library pays a lot of money for us to have access to databases that contain all kinds of useful resources. Can you guys guess where all that money comes from? Well, if you're thinking it probably comes out of my own student fees, then yeah, you're right. You guys are paying for the access to these databases. So you might as well get your money's worth and use them. But even if you weren't paying directly for them, these databases contain a lot of resources that are behind paywalls. So, which means that you can't access them in any other way. So this is really gives you access to good source material that you can't get from anywhere else. So use the databases. Now these different databases, and there's a whole bunch of them. I'll show you a big list in a minute once we get online. But these databases cover different areas of study and contain different types of source material. Some of that source material is academic, some of it's not. Okay, so I want to tell you about a few of the most useful library databases that can be used to search for academic sources related to language and literature. So this is not an exhaustive list. There are other databases that will give you those types of sources, but these are three pretty good ones that I recommend. So Project Muse, JSTOR, and EBSCO. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of these three, and then we'll get online and do a couple of sample searches. So Project Muse is a really good database because it is very specific to language and literature. Everything that you find on there is going to be somehow related to the study of language or literature. It's also full text, which means that any source that's listed in that database is going to have the full text right there for you to access. And then the other good characteristic of it is that it's all academic sources. Everything in Project Muse comes either from an academic book or an academic journal. Now, as I mentioned before, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything there is going to be a good source for you to use, because that's also going to include things like introductory material for a journal issue, or book reviews, or other things that might be in an academic journal, but not really a full-length peer-reviewed article. So we still need to be a little bit careful. JSTOR is another really good source. It's a little bit broader in the sense that it covers a lot of the social science disciplines, so it's not specific to language and literature, but it does provide a lot of source material from sources that deal with language and literature. It's also full text, so everything in there is going to be full text. And JSTOR is mostly academic. It does provide source material from some other types of sources, but most of the material there is going to be academic. So we need to be a little bit careful and make sure that we're accessing the right kind of sources. And it has different filters, like you can check a box that says, only give me sources from an academic journal, etc. So we'll look at a little bit of that kind of thing. And then finally, EBSCO is one that I assume most people are already familiar with because it's very broadly used. It includes all disciplines, so you probably use this in other classes. It's mostly full text. I think EBSCO does provide some source listings for sources that you can't access directly through EBSCO. But most of the things that it lists, it will provide you with the full text of. But then EBSCO provides a lot of non-academic source material as well. So when we're using EBSCO, we have to be really careful that we're getting the right kind of source material. But it's also really easy to tell what that right kind of source material is. It's got little symbols that indicate, this is an academic journal, right? So we'll look briefly at that too. So we're about to go online. I'm going to do a sample search in JSTOR. And then we'll do a quick one in EBSCO as well, just to kind of give you a sense of how these things work. Okay, so I wanted to run through a couple of quick sample searches using the JSTOR database. So I am here at the library's home site, the John B. Coleman Library webpage, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit so that we can get to this link for databases A through Z. That's where I want to start. So I click on that, and it pulls up the full list of databases that the library, again, pays a lot of money from your student fees to give you access to. And as you can see, this is a huge list. Like, we're just in the A's right here, and if we keep scrolling down, we'll get into the B's. So there's tons of these databases that the library provides us access to. We're looking for JSTOR, so I'm going to click on J here at the top and scroll down. There's JSTOR. Now at this point, you might need to, if you're off campus, you might need to enter your ID and password. That's just the normal ID and password that you use to get into your email or anything else, right? But here I'm in JSTOR. I always like to, in any of these databases, I like to start with the advanced search. So I click on advanced search, and that's where we can combine terms. So if I put a term in this top box and then another term in this bottom box, it'll combine them together and we'll get a more specific search. So let's say that we are researching Sandra Cisneros' short story, Woman Hollering Creek. Now, Woman Hollering Creek is a pretty specific title, so we could just type in Woman Hollering Creek and probably find what we need. But generally speaking, I think it's also a good idea to have the author's name in the search as well. So I'm going to put Sandro Cisneros in the top box, and then Woman Hollering Creek in the bottom box. We got to make sure that we spell everything right, otherwise it's going to throw our search off, right? So double check spelling. So we're going to click on search. And here we get 206 hits. These are sources that somewhere mention Sandra Cisneros and the title of her short story, Woman Hollering Creek. Now, as I mentioned, most of these are going to be academic sources, and you can even click on some of these filters over here. So you could just get the journal articles, you could just get the book chapters. But we can see from the titles there's some pretty interesting journal articles here on Cisneros' short story. When I teach this short story, I focus a lot on that La Llorona figure, so this one looks really interesting to me. If I wanted to get this article and read it, I would click on Download PDF, accept and proceed to download. That's going to pull up the PDF itself. Now, anytime you're doing a search, you can use this page to maybe get a sense of whether this is a source that you might actually want to keep or not. But once you decide that this is a source that you might use and you want to keep track of it, you want to make sure that you download it onto your own drive, whatever kind of drive that you're using. And don't just count on your ability to get back into this database at any time and find this specific article. Okay, so if I'm here, I'm going to click on the download button and actually download this article, and that way I can access it whenever I need to. Okay, we can also there's options for we can check mark the articles that we like, and then there's this box where we can export them. I don't really use this. I'm not sure that this is a very useful tool. Some of the databases allow us to email the articles to ourselves. I find that really useful, but I don't see that option in JSTOR. So the best thing here is to make sure that you just go ahead and download whatever article you're interested in possibly using, right? So that's really easy. Now, the thing about working with short fiction, if you're researching a novel, then chances are you're going to find articles and book chapters that are specifically about that novel. So if you're working on Richard Wright's A Native Son, for instance, there's going to be tons of articles specifically about Native Son. With short fiction, that's not always the case. Now, Woman Hollering Creek is a very important and popular short story. It's been anthologized in tons of places. So there's a lot of material written specifically about that story. But that's not the case for all short stories. So let's say we're researching a story that is a little less famous. So I'm going to choose Alice Walker's short story called The Abortion. Okay, so I'm going to put in Alice Walker, and let's see, do I need the or not? I'm just going to put abortion in here. Now, unfortunately, with this story, probably I'm going to get a lot of stuff that's about Alice Walker and just kind of the topic of abortion rather than that specific story. But I think if we went through, we've got, because abortion is a common word, we've got a ton of hits here, over 2,000. And I think if we, scrolled through a bunch of these, we would quickly find that none of these, or not many of them, are specifically about that particular story. It's not one that's broadly anthologized or broadly read in classes. And so there's not a whole lot of material written specifically about that. And so we might need to broaden the terms of our search, and we might need to use source material that's not specifically about the abortion, but that is about maybe Alice Walker and maybe one of the key themes that we're thinking about with the abortion. So I'm going to go back to my advanced search, And let's say, the abortion, that story has a lot to do with Alice Walker's critique of the civil rights movement as a patriarchal uh, institution, in a sense. And so I'm specifically interested in what it's saying about her relationship to the civil rights movement. So I'm going to type in Alice Walker, and in the second box, I'm going to put in civil rights movement. Now, let's kind of start scrolling through. We have some book chapters here. We have some journal articles. If I come down to this first journal article, Remembering the Dream, Alice Walker, Meridian, and the Civil Rights Movement. So that's clearly connected to Alice Walker and the Civil Rights Movement. As it happens, Meridian is one of her early novels, and it's very much concerned with her connection to the civil rights movement. She was involved in some of the voting rights drives, etc. And this story is drawn largely from her experience there. So that would be a really relevant one that we might want to use. Here's another one about that same novel, Meridian, Alice Walker's Critique of Revolution, right? And so what we'd want to do is kind of look through some of those articles, and we would be looking for aspects of the arguments in those articles that we could then connect in some way to what we want to say about her short story, The Abortion. And so we would use those articles in those ways, even if we can't find articles specifically about the abortion. Okay? So that's a pretty good glimpse at JSTOR. One thing to notice on the left side here, as I mentioned, most of the material in JSTOR is going to be academic content, but some of it's not. So you'll see academic content here that covers journals, book chapters, research reports, but then you also see primary source content here, so pamphlets, serials, documents, books. These aren't the kinds of things that we would want to be using as academic sources for our papers. So one thing we could do, for instance, is just say, okay, I just want to see the journal articles. So I click on that box, and it's only going to show me the journal articles from the search that I did, right? Okay, I want to switch over now to EBSCO because that's a really huge, really popular database, and it's one that we can use for researching language and literature topics, although we have to be a little bit careful with it. So I want to show you a few things there. So I'm back at the library homepage. I'm going to go back down to databases A through Z. Now I'm going to click on E for EBSCO. So here's EBSCO, and we need to be a little bit careful with EBSCO because it's kind of a broad umbrella database that includes a whole bunch of smaller databases within it. And so if we just click on the first thing we see, eJournals, EBSCO host, that's not really going to take us to the right place. So what we want to do is scroll down a little bit to here where we see EBSCO host, search all EBSCO databases. It's even got a little popular box here. So we want to make sure that we search all the EBSCO databases because we don't want to try to pick and choose like which ones are going to be relevant to what we're trying to do. It's easiest just to search all of them. So when we click on that, it takes us to the second page, and then this is an important moment. We need to select all. Again, if we don't do that, we're just going to be searching one specific EBSCO database instead of all of them. So we select all, we continue. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to our Sandra Cisneros search. I'm going to search for Woman Hollering Creek, and let's see what comes up. All right, so lots of sources about Woman Hollering Creek. And one thing to notice, as I mentioned, EBSCO provides a lot of non-academic source material. And so if we look, what we're looking at right now, these first four sources are not actually academic sources. How do I know that? Well, the really easy and quick way to tell is by these little diagrams on the left. So this is an ebook, so that's the actual text of Woman Hollering Creek, which is helpful, but it's not an academic source. And another ebook, a book. I'm not sure what kind of source that is exactly. But if we scroll down to number 5, we see academic journal. Hey, that's exactly what we're looking for, right? We want the academic journal articles. Unfortunately, on this particular article, we don't have the full text access. And so that's not one that we're going to be able to access directly through EBSCO. We might be able to find this article through a different database, but that's a little bit more of a complex process to find. But if we come down and look at number 6, that's an academic journal, and we have the full text right here. We can just click on that, and it's going to pull up the page from which we can download this article. All right, so here again, we want to click on the download button and save that into a relevant drive. Another thing that I like about EBSCO, if we go back, we can also put whatever articles we want into a folder. So I could click on this little folder, stick it in my folder. I don't know, let's say I need the actual text of the document. I can click on that. And then I can go to my folder view. So if I click on the folder up here, well, I'm not sure why I'd only put one in there instead of both of them, but I can select all, and then I can click on the email button. I think you can also click on email just when you're looking at the source, the single source itself. But when I click on the email button, that gives me the option to send this source as an email to myself. So if you're on a device where you can't really save the document right there, you can always email it to yourself, and that will send the full PDF of that document. So it's really easy to use these databases like JSTOR and EBSCO to find good academic sources and access those sources really quickly and conveniently. Okay. So that's it for this discussion. I hope you found that useful. So go out and get on these databases and start finding some good sources for your own paper. You can find the PowerPoint used in this video on eCourses, and you should also check on eCourses for any quizzes or discussion boards related to this video. Thanks for watching.